Sarah Martinez, 28, watched through her window as her neighbor's son carried his belongings to the curb like trash. 24 hours later, she watched that same failure step out of a Bentley in front of a mansion worth more than her father's entire net worth. But here's what nobody saw coming, including his own father, who was now begging for forgiveness on his knees. This isn't just another rich kid story. This is about a son who let his father believe he was worthless while secretly building an empire that would make his dad's business look like a lemonade stand. And when the truth finally came out, it destroyed everything his father thought he knew about success, family, and the son he threw away like garbage. My name is Alex Sterling, and this is how I went from homeless to owning my father's world in less than 48 hours. Think of the one person who broke you. Got them? Let's begin. But before we move on, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. The smell of disappointment hung thick in the Sterling mansion that Tuesday morning, mixing with the aroma of imported Colombian coffee that Robert Sterling insisted on serving to his business associates. Alex Sterling sat at the marble kitchen island, his laptop barely concealing what looked like another online gaming session, while his father paced behind him in his perfectly pressed Armani suit. To anyone watching, it was the same scene that had played out countless times over the past 3 years. The successful real estate mogul frustrated with his 26-year-old son, who seemed allergic to ambition. "Do you see this?" Robert's voice carried the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from years of crushed expectations. He gestured toward the newspaper spread across the granite countertop, where his latest development project dominated the business section. Sterling Properties just closed the biggest commercial deal in Miami's history, $47 million, Alex. And what are you contributing to this family legacy? His voice rose with each word, echoing off the vaulted ceilings that Alex had grown up under but never seemed to appreciate. Alex barely looked up from his screen, his fingers continuing their rhythmic tapping on the keyboard. His dark hair was unkempt, falling across eyes that his father interpreted as vacant, but which actually held secrets worth more than the mansion they sat in. "I'm working on something, Dad," he mumbled, the same response he'd given for months. His voice carried just enough disinterest to maintain the carefully constructed image he'd spent years perfecting. The neighbors had long ago stopped asking Robert about his son's career prospects. Sarah Martinez next door had watched Alex stumble home at all hours, sometimes carrying what looked like computer equipment, sometimes nothing at all. The community had written him off as another trust fund kid who'd never learned the value of hard work. Even Robert's business partners had stopped inquiring about bringing Alex into the company, their polite smiles barely concealing their relief that they wouldn't have to deal with Sterling's problem child. What nobody knew was that Alex's apparent failures were actually strategic masterpieces. His dropout from Stanford hadn't been academic failure. He'd completed his computer science degree in 3 years, graduating summa cum laude, while maintaining the fiction that he was struggling with basic coursework. The late nights his father assumed were spent partying were actually 18-hour coding sessions, building the foundation of what would become one of Miami's most innovative tech startups. The dead-end job at a local electronics store that his father constantly ridiculed was actually a cover for his real work, consulting for major corporations on cybersecurity solutions under a carefully constructed business identity. Every dismissive comment from his father, every disappointed shake of the head from family friends, only strengthened Alex's resolve to maintain his cover until the moment was perfect for revelation. Robert Sterling had built his empire on real estate, buying low and selling high, understanding that perception often mattered more than reality in business deals. He never imagined that his own son had learned that lesson better than anyone, constructing a perception so convincing that even his own father believed it completely. The irony wasn't lost on Alex that the man who'd taught him about the power of strategic deception had become its most complete victim. As his father continued his familiar tirade about responsibility and family legacy, Alex allowed himself the smallest smile. Tomorrow, everything would change, and the man who'd spent years calling him worthless would discover just how wrong a father could be about his own son. The explosion came at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night, just as Alex had calculated it would. He'd been watching his father's patterns for months, noting how Robert's patience wore thinnest during the third week of each month when quarterly reports demanded his attention. Alex pushed through the front door carrying a laptop bag and what appeared to be fast food, the perfect image of another wasted evening. The timing was deliberate, designed to trigger the confrontation that would set everything in motion. Robert Sterling stood in the marble foyer like a statue of paternal disappointment, still wearing his business suit despite the late hour. His face carried the particular shade of red that Alex had learned to recognize as the point of no return. "Where the hell have you been?" The question exploded from him with 3 years of accumulated frustration. "Do you have any idea what time it is? What people are saying about this family?" Alex set down his bag with practiced nonchalance, letting his shoulders slump in the defeated posture he'd perfected over years of performance. "I was at Dave's place working on some freelance stuff." The lie rolled off his tongue effortlessly. In reality, he'd been in a downtown Miami conference room, finalizing the acquisition of a struggling software company that would triple his portfolio's value by morning. "Freelance stuff?" Robert's voice cracked with disbelief. "Alex, I just got off the phone with Jim Morrison from Morrison Development. His 23-year-old son just closed his second $1 million real estate deal this year. 23, Alex. And you're sitting around playing video games and delivering food like some college dropout." The comparison stung exactly as it was meant to, but not for the reasons Robert imagined. Alex had actually met Morrison's son at a tech conference where the young real estate prodigy had pitched him on a joint venture. The irony of his father praising someone who now sought his business partnership was almost too perfect, but Alex maintained his expression of mild indifference. "Not everyone can be a golden boy, Dad." Alex's response carried just enough bitterness to sound authentic. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times, knowing that his father's pride would never allow him to back down once pushed to this point. The psychology was simple. Robert Sterling had built his identity on being the successful father who would pass his empire to a worthy heir. Alex's apparent failures didn't just disappoint him. They threatened the very foundation of who Robert believed himself to be. "You know what? I'm done." Robert's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than his earlier shouting. "I have spent 26 years investing in you, believing that somehow you'd find your way, that maybe you had some hidden potential I just couldn't see." He stepped closer, and Alex could smell the expensive cologne that had been his father's signature since childhood. "But you're not hidden potential, Alex, you're just potential wasted." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Alex felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes negotiations. This was it, the moment he'd been orchestrating for months. "What are you saying, Dad?" His voice carried just the right note of wounded confusion, masking the excitement building in his chest. "I'm saying get out." Robert's voice was steady now, cold with finality. "Pack your things and get out of my house. Tonight. I won't spend another day watching you waste the opportunities I've given you, embarrassing this family name that I spent 30 years building." He turned toward the stairs, then paused. "The credit cards are canceled. The allowance is done. If you want to act like you're not my son, then you're not my son anymore." Alex watched his father climb the marble staircase, each step echoing through the foyer like a countdown to revolution. Phase 1 was complete, and in 18 hours, Robert Sterling would understand exactly what kind of son he'd just thrown away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sterling estate as Alex methodically loaded his belongings into 2 worn duffel bags, each item carefully selected for maximum visual impact. He made sure to be visible from the street, knowing that Sarah Martinez would be walking her dog at exactly 7:30 a.m., and that Mrs. Chen from across the street always tended her garden before the Miami heat became unbearable. The neighborhood needed to witness this carefully choreographed humiliation. Robert Sterling stood at his bedroom window, still in his silk pajamas, watching his son's exile with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed he'd finally taken control of an impossible situation. He'd slept poorly, waking every few hours with the nagging feeling that he might have been too harsh, but morning light had hardened his resolve. Tough love, he told himself. Sometimes a father had to destroy his son to save him. Alex moved with deliberate slowness, allowing each neighbor to absorb the full spectacle of Sterling family dysfunction. He could feel their stares, hear the whispered conversations behind manicured hedges, sense the mixture of pity and judgment that wealthy communities reserved for their fallen members. Mrs. Rodriguez pretended to water her already soaked flower beds while stealing glances at the drama unfolding across the street. The Peterson twins, home from their Ivy League colleges for spring break, watched from their upstairs window with the cruel fascination of youth observing someone else's misfortune. The psychological impact on his father was exactly what Alex had calculated. Robert Sterling's identity was inextricably linked to his reputation in this exclusive Coral Gables neighborhood, where success was measured not just in dollars but in family legacy. Having a son publicly ejected from the family home was a humiliation that would ripple through country club conversations and charity gala whispers for months. Alex was weaponizing his father's own pride against him. Need help with anything else? The question came from Carlos, the family's groundskeeper, whose concerned expression carried genuine affection. Carlos had watched Alex grow up, had been the one to teach him to ride a bike when Robert was too busy with business deals. The older man's weathered hands trembled slightly as he helped load the final bag, and Alex felt a genuine pang of guilt for the deception he was inflicting on someone who truly cared about him. "I'll be fine, Carlos." Alex's voice carried real warmth for the first time in the performance. Sometimes things need to fall apart before they can come together the right way. The words were cryptic enough to maintain his cover while offering a hint of hope to the man who'd been more of a father figure than his actual father in many ways. At 8:15 a.m., the locksmith arrived, a final, brutal punctuation mark on Alex's expulsion. The man worked efficiently, his tools singing against the metal as he changed every lock on the Sterling mansion. Alex watched from the sidewalk, his bags at his feet, as his childhood home was literally sealed against his return. The symbolism wasn't lost on the gathering crowd of neighbors, who now made no pretense of hiding their voyeuristic interest in the Sterling family's meltdown. Sarah Martinez finally approached, her golden retriever providing the perfect excuse for conversation. "Alex, honey, are you okay? Do you need somewhere to stay?" Her offer was genuine, born from years of watching him grow up in the house next door, but Alex could see the calculation behind her kindness, the social currency that helping the fallen Sterling heir might provide in future neighborhood politics. "Thanks, Mrs. Martinez, but I've got it figured out." Alex shouldered his bags with the resigned dignity of someone accepting his fate, though inside he was counting down the hours until his carefully orchestrated comeback would begin. Sometimes a man has to find his own way, you know? As he walked down the tree-lined street that had been his world for 26 years, Alex could feel his father's eyes burning into his back from the second-floor window. The man who'd raised him was probably feeling a mixture of vindication and loss, convinced he'd done the right thing while already beginning to question whether exile was too harsh a punishment for disappointment. By tomorrow evening, Robert Sterling would understand that disappointment was a luxury he could no longer afford, and that the son he'd discarded was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The call came at exactly 2:47 p.m. the following day, just as Alex had programmed it to. He sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from his father's office, watching Robert's BMW pull into the Sterling Properties parking garage through the window when his phone buzzed with the precision of Swiss clockwork. The caller ID showed only a number, but Alex knew exactly who was on the other end. Martinez Holdings, the shell company he'd established 2 years earlier as part of his long-term strategy. "Mr. Sterling." The voice belonged to Elena Vasquez, his personal assistant who operated under the Martinez Holdings umbrella, her professional demeanor perfect for the role she'd been rehearsing for months. "This is Elena from Martinez Holdings. I'm calling to confirm that your property is ready for immediate occupancy. All security systems have been activated, and the staff is prepared for your arrival." Alex raised his voice just enough to ensure the nearby tables could overhear, knowing that small-town gossip traveled faster than Miami traffic during rush hour. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number. I don't own any property." The confusion in his voice was Academy Award worthy. masking the satisfaction he felt as his plan moved into its next phase. "Sir, I have you listed as Alexander Sterling, sole owner of the Biscayne Bay Estate at 4000 Collins Avenue. The $45 million transfer was completed yesterday and all documentation is in order." Elena's voice carried professional certainty mixed with slight concern, as if she was beginning to doubt her own records. Perhaps there's been some confusion with the timing? The coffee shop had gone noticeably quieter, and Alex could feel the attention of every customer focused on his conversation. Miami was a city where real estate transactions were dinner party conversations, and $45 million wasn't a number that got mentioned casually. He watched a woman at the corner table discreetly pull out her phone, probably texting friends about the mysterious property deal she was overhearing. $45 million? Alex's voice cracked with what sounded like disbelief, but was actually carefully controlled excitement. "Ma'am, I think you definitely have the wrong person. I was just kicked out of my father's house yesterday. I'm homeless." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on him. In 12 hours, he'd go from genuinely homeless to owning one of Miami's most exclusive properties. Elena continued with professional persistence. "Mr. Sterling, I understand your confusion, but our records are quite clear. You established Martinez Holdings in 2022, and yesterday's acquisition was the culmination of a 2-year investment strategy. I have your digital signature on all documents as well as biometric verification from your visits to our offices." She paused, letting the weight of official documentation settle into the conversation. "Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this in person." Alex could practically feel the coffee shop's collective intake of breath. The barista had stopped pretending to clean the espresso machine, and even the jazz music seemed to have lowered its volume to accommodate the dramatic conversation unfolding at table 7. "I have no idea what you're talking about, but I suppose I should come see what this is about." His voice carried the bewildered resignation of someone caught in bureaucratic confusion, though internally he was marveling at how perfectly the performance was playing out. "Excellent, sir. I'll have a car sent to pick you up. Where are you currently located?" Elena's efficiency was flawless, maintaining the illusion that this was a standard business operation rather than an elaborate family revenge scheme years in the making. "I'm at Cafe Cubano on Miracle Mile." Alex provided the address while watching more customers pull out their phones, the modern equivalent of town criers spreading news through digital networks. By evening, half of Coral Gables would know that someone named Alexander Sterling had apparently inherited or purchased a $45 million property, though the details remained mysteriously unclear. 20 minutes later, a black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the cafe's entrance, its presence commanding immediate attention from both pedestrians and the coffee shop's increasingly fascinated audience. The driver, dressed in a crisp chauffeur's uniform, entered the cafe and approached Alex's table with professional precision. "Mr. Sterling, I'm here to escort you to the Martinez Holdings office." Alex gathered his duffel bags with the awkward uncertainty of someone thrust into circumstances beyond their understanding, while every eye in the cafe tracked his movement toward the luxury vehicle. As the Mercedes pulled away from the curb, he caught a glimpse of Robert Sterling's office building in the distance and smiled. His father's workday was about to become very interesting, especially when the neighborhood gossip network delivered news of his homeless son's mysterious windfall. The first domino had fallen, and the Sterling family dynamics were about to shift in ways that Robert could never have anticipated when he changed those locks yesterday morning. Robert Sterling's Thursday afternoon board meeting was interrupted by his secretary's nervous knock at the conference room door. Patricia had worked for Sterling Properties for 8 years and had never once disrupted a meeting with investors, which made her pale complexion and trembling hands all the more alarming. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation at your residence that requires immediate attention." The 12 men in tailored suits around the mahogany table shifted uncomfortably as Robert excused himself, following Patricia to the window that overlooked the building's parking garage. Below, a convoy of black vehicles had assembled, 2 Range Rovers flanking a Bentley Bentayga, with a Mercedes van bringing up the rear. The procession looked like something reserved for diplomats or celebrities, certainly not the kind of scene that belonged in the quiet residential streets of Coral Gables. "Sir, they're asking for Alexander Sterling." Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "The lead driver has legal documents and says they need to speak with him urgently. They've been waiting at your house for 20 minutes. Her confusion was evident. Everyone in the office knew that Robert had disowned his son just 2 days earlier, making this official-looking delegation all the more mysterious. Robert's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had Alex gotten himself into legal trouble? Was this some kind of debt collection gone wrong? The timing couldn't be worse, with potential investors from New York sitting in his conference room, probably wondering why their host had disappeared during a crucial presentation about Sterling Properties' expansion plans. The drive to his Coral Gables estate took 18 minutes, during which Robert's anxiety transformed into anger. Whatever mess Alex had created, it was now threatening to spill over into Robert's professional life, potentially costing him millions in investment deals. The boy's capacity for creating problems seemed limitless, even after being cut off from family resources. When Robert pulled into his circular driveway, the scene that greeted him defied every assumption he'd made during the drive home. The convoy wasn't there to collect Alex, they were there to deliver him. The Bentley's rear door opened with mechanical precision, and Alex stepped out wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His posture was different, straighter, carrying an authority that Robert had never seen in his son's bearing. Behind Alex emerged a woman in her early 30s, Hispanic, wearing a navy business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed expensive legal representation. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, her eyes scanning the Sterling mansion with professional assessment rather than neighborhood curiosity. A security detail flanked them. 2 men whose build and alertness suggested military backgrounds, not the typical rent-a-cops that Miami's wealthy employed for show. Sarah Martinez appeared at her front door, her morning coffee forgotten as she witnessed the spectacle unfolding next door. The woman who'd offered Alex a place to stay just yesterday now stared in bewildered silence as he commanded a team of professionals that clearly answered to him. Her golden retriever whined softly, sensing the tension that had descended on the usually peaceful neighborhood. "Dad?" Alex's voice carried a formality that Robert had never heard before, devoid of the casual disrespect that had characterized their interactions for years. "I believe you've met Elena Vasquez from Martinez Holdings. She has some documents that require your attention." The introduction was delivered with corporate precision, as if they were strangers conducting business rather than father and son navigating a family crisis. Elena stepped forward, extending her hand to Robert with professional courtesy. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the unexpected visit, but there are legal matters regarding your son that require immediate clarification." Her accent carried the educated polish of someone who moved comfortably in Miami's international business community, and her grip was firm enough to suggest she wasn't intimidated by wealthy real estate developers. Robert found himself shaking hands with a woman whose presence suggested that his assumptions about Alex's life had been fundamentally wrong. The convoy, the security, the professional entourage, none of it matched the narrative of failure and disappointment that had driven him to exile his son. As Elena opened her portfolio and began extracting documents, Robert Sterling realized that the next few minutes would either validate his parental judgment or destroy everything he thought he knew about the young man he'd raised. Elena Vasquez spread the documents across the hood of the Bentley with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to life-changing revelations. The morning sun glinted off the vehicle's polished surface, creating an impromptu conference table that commanded attention from every neighbor brave enough to venture onto their front lawns. Robert Sterling approached the makeshift display with the wariness of a man sensing that his world was about to shift beneath his feet. "These are property deeds for the Biscayne Bay estate," Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered similar presentations to Miami's most powerful families. "Purchased yesterday for $45 million, cash transaction by Alexander Sterling through Martinez Holdings." She pointed to Alex's signature at the bottom of each page, the ink still bearing the embossed seal of Miami-Dade County's recorder's office. Robert's hands trembled as he lifted the first document, his real estate expertise automatically cataloging details that made no sense in the context of his supposedly worthless son. The property in question was a waterfront mansion in one of Miami's most exclusive neighborhoods, the kind of estate that appeared in Architectural Digest and commanded attention from international buyers. He'd actually toured the property 2 years earlier when it first came on the market, dismissing it as overpriced even for his substantial portfolio. "There must be some mistake." Robert's voice cracked with the strain of maintaining composure while his understanding of reality crumbled around him. "Alex doesn't have this kind of money. Yesterday he was living in my house, unemployed, with no visible means of support." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, contradicted by the legal documents bearing official seals and his son's undeniably authentic signature. Elena's expression remained professionally neutral as she produced the next set of papers. Bank statements from Meridian Private Wealth Management, showing current liquid assets of $67 million across multiple investment accounts. The pages detailed a financial portfolio that dwarfed Robert's own holdings, with timestamps showing consistent growth over the past 3 years. "Your son has been our client since 2022, though he requested absolute discretion regarding his accounts." The numbers blurred as Robert tried to process information that challenged every assumption he'd made about his son's capabilities. $67 million represented more liquid wealth than Sterling Properties had generated in its best year, and the account statements showed sophisticated investment strategies that required either exceptional financial acumen or access to elite advisory services. Neither possibility aligned with the young man who'd struggled to balance his college checking account. Alex stood silently beside the convoy, his expression unreadable as he watched his father grapple with documents that revealed years of carefully hidden success. The transformation in his bearing was complete. Gone was the slouching posture and defensive attitude that had characterized their interactions. In its place stood a man who clearly commanded respect from professionals accustomed to serving Miami's wealthiest families. "Corporate filings for Sterling Tech Solutions," Elena continued, producing a thick folder bound in leather. "Incorporated in Delaware in 2022 with Alexander Sterling as sole proprietor and CEO. Current valuation based on last month's independent assessment, $38 million. The company name's deliberate similarity to Sterling Properties wasn't lost on Robert, who recognized the psychological warfare inherent in his son's choice of corporate identity. Mrs. Chen had abandoned all pretense of gardening and now stood openly at her property line, her pruning shears forgotten as she absorbed the financial revelations unfolding across the street. The Peterson twins had been joined by their parents at their upstairs window, creating an impromptu neighborhood theater where Robert Sterling's parental failures were being documented in real time. "The cybersecurity contracts," Elena's voice cut through Robert's spiraling thoughts, "include work for Fortune 500 companies, 3 Miami banks, and several international corporations that I'm not authorized to name due to confidentiality agreements." She flipped through pages of signed contracts, each bearing corporate logos that Robert recognized from the business pages of the Wall Street Journal. The final document Elena produced was a letter of credit from Swiss Banking Corporation, authorizing expenditures up to $100 million for real estate acquisitions in South Florida. The bank's letterhead carried watermarks and security features that Robert knew couldn't be forged, while the signature belonged to a managing director whose name appeared regularly in international finance publications. "Your son," Elena concluded, "has requested that I inform you of his current financial position to provide context for yesterday's family discussion." Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the fact that Alex had orchestrated this revelation as a direct response to being disowned, turning his father's rejection into a teachable moment about the dangers of underestimating people. Robert Sterling looked up from the documents to find his son watching him with eyes that held no anger, no vindication, only the patient observation of someone who had predicted this exact moment and was now witnessing its inevitable unfolding. The man he'd raised, dismissed, and ultimately exiled had become someone Robert didn't recognize, someone whose success made his own accomplishments look modest by comparison. The motorcade moved through Miami's streets like a presidential convoy, with Alex's Bentley leading the procession while Robert Sterling followed in his BMW, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The route took them through neighborhoods where Robert had conducted business for decades, past developments he'd built and properties he'd sold, all of which now seemed diminished by the revelations of the past hour. Traffic parted for the official-looking convoy, drivers craning their necks to catch glimpses of whoever commanded such an impressive escort. Elena's voice crackled through the radio system that connected all vehicles in the convoy, her professional commentary serving as a real estate tour guide for property worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. The Biscayne Bay estate sits on 2.3 acres of direct waterfront, with 400 feet of private beach and deep-water docking facilities capable of accommodating yachts up to 200 feet in length. Her descriptions painted a picture of luxury that exceeded even Robert's considerable standards. The entrance to Star Island required passage through a security checkpoint that rivaled exclusive country clubs, with guards who clearly recognized Alex's vehicles and waved the convoy through without hesitation. Robert's BMW was temporarily stopped while his identification was verified, a small humiliation that underscored his position as a visitor in what was apparently his son's neighborhood. The guard's deference to Alex suggested this wasn't his first visit to the exclusive enclave. As they approached 4000 Collins Avenue, Robert's breath caught in his throat. The estate that came into view was architectural poetry written in limestone and glass, a modern masterpiece that somehow managed to honor classical proportions while embracing contemporary innovation. The mansion rose from manicured grounds like a monument to success, its clean lines and soaring spaces visible through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered glimpses of interior luxury beyond Robert's imagination. The main gate opened with silent precision, revealing a circular driveway paved in hand-cut Italian marble that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. Mature royal palms lined the approach, their fronds swaying in the ocean breeze that carried the salt tang of Biscayne Bay. Water features integrated seamlessly with the landscape design, creating a symphony of flowing water that masked the sounds of traffic from the distant mainland. Alex stepped from the Bentley with the casual confidence of a man arriving at his own castle, while Robert emerged from his BMW feeling like a tourist visiting a museum. The size of the estate dwarfed even the Sterling family mansion in Coral Gables, and the attention to detail visible in every landscape element suggested the involvement of world-class designers working with an unlimited budget. The main residence encompasses 18,000 square feet of living space across 3 levels, Elena explained, as she led the group toward the main entrance, with an additional 5,000 square feet of covered outdoor entertaining areas. The property includes a separate guest house, staff quarters, and a 4-car garage that currently houses Mr. Sterling's vehicle collection. Her tour guide commentary was delivered with the pride of someone presenting a crown jewel. The front doors were crafted from solid mahogany with bronze inlays that caught the sunlight like precious metals, opening to reveal an interior that combined old-world craftsmanship with cutting-edge technology. The foyer soared 3 stories, with a custom chandelier that appeared to be made from thousands of individual crystal drops suspended in a pattern that mimicked ocean waves. The marble floors were book-matched slabs that created flowing patterns beneath their feet. Sarah Martinez had somehow managed to follow the convoy in her own vehicle, parking discreetly outside the estate's gates where she could observe the proceedings through the ornate metalwork. Her presence represented the neighborhood gossip network that would ensure every detail of this revelation spread through Coral Gables' social circles within hours, transforming Robert Sterling from successful developer to the father who'd failed to recognize his own son's achievements. As they moved through rooms that showcased museum-quality art and furniture that belonged in design magazines, Robert found himself calculating the cost of everything he saw. The kitchen alone represented a 6-figure investment in commercial-grade appliances and custom cabinetry, while the master suite occupied an entire wing of the second floor, with views that commanded premium prices in Miami's luxury real estate market. The home theater seats 24 people and features projection equipment used in commercial cinemas, Elena continued, opening doors to reveal spaces that transformed a private residence into an entertainment destination. The wine cellar maintains climate control for a 500-bottle collection, and the home gym includes equipment found in professional training facilities. But it was the view from the main terrace that finally broke Robert's composure. The estate's rear facade opened onto Biscayne Bay through retractable glass walls that disappeared entirely, creating seamless indoor-outdoor living spaces that captured Miami's eternal summer. An infinity pool seemed to merge with the bay beyond, while a private yacht dock hosted a Sunseeker yacht that represented another seven-figure investment. Standing on the terrace that overlooked water worth more than most small cities, Robert Sterling finally understood that his son hadn't just hidden his success. He'd built an empire that made Robert's own achievements look like practice exercises. The young man he'd dismissed as worthless now owned a slice of paradise that would be featured in luxury lifestyle magazines and envied by Miami's most successful families. The revelation began in Alex's home office, a space that occupied the entire third floor of the mansion and commanded panoramic views of Biscayne Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room's centerpiece was a custom-built desk crafted from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, surrounded by monitors displaying real-time financial data that would make Wall Street traders envious. Robert Sterling stood frozen in the doorway, watching his son navigate between screens with the fluid expertise of someone who'd spent years mastering global markets. Sterling Tech Solutions started as a side project during my sophomore year at Stanford, Alex began, his voice carrying the measured tone of a CEO delivering an investor presentation. What you thought was academic failure was actually me completing my computer science degree in 3 years while building the foundation of what would become Miami's fastest-growing cybersecurity firm. He gestured toward a wall displaying framed certificates and awards, including recognition from the Department of Homeland Security for innovative security protocols. Elena moved to a display case containing physical representations of Alex's digital empire, hardware prototypes, signed contracts with Fortune 500 companies, and photographs of Alex with technology leaders whose names dominated business headlines. Your son's encryption algorithms are currently protecting financial transactions for 3 of the largest banks in Latin America, she explained, her pride evident as she detailed accomplishments that had remained hidden from the man who'd raised him. Robert's legs felt unsteady as he absorbed the magnitude of his son's deception. The late nights he'd attributed to partying had actually been coding sessions that generated millions in revenue. The dead-end job at the electronics store had been cover for consulting work that commanded hourly rates exceeding what most lawyers charged. Every assumption he'd made about Alex's activities had been not just wrong, but catastrophically opposite to reality. The cryptocurrency mining operation alone generates approximately $2 million monthly, Alex continued, pulling up blockchain data that showed transactions flowing through digital wallets like electronic rivers of wealth. The servers are housed in a climate-controlled facility in Hialeah, powered by solar arrays that make the operation carbon neutral while maximizing profit margins. The environmental consciousness surprised Robert, who'd never heard his son express interest in sustainability issues. The office's secondary area housed a conference table where Alex had clearly conducted high-level business meetings, evidenced by photographs showing him in discussion with executives from companies whose logos Robert recognized from their advertising during major sporting events. One image showed Alex shaking hands with a man Robert immediately identified as the CEO of a tech giant whose stock price movements made front-page financial news. The artificial intelligence project launched last month, Elena added, accessing files on Alex's computer that displayed complex neural network diagrams and performance metrics. Early testing shows applications for everything from medical diagnosis to financial prediction modeling. 3 venture capital firms are competing to invest with preliminary valuations starting at $50 million. The casual mention of such astronomical figures made Robert's own business dealings seem quaint by comparison. Alex moved to a presentation screen that displayed a timeline of his business development, each milestone carefully documented with dates that corresponded to periods when Robert had been most critical of his son's apparent lack of direction. While you were lecturing me about responsibility, I was filing patents for security protocols that IBM now licenses for their enterprise clients. While you complained about my work ethic, I was negotiating contracts with international corporations that needed discrete cybersecurity solutions. The psychological impact of each revelation was devastating. Robert realized that not only had he completely misjudged his son's capabilities, but his constant criticism had been delivered during Alex's most productive and successful periods. Every disappointed lecture had been based on ignorance of achievements that exceeded Robert's own professional accomplishments by orders of magnitude. "The irony," Alex said, turning to face his father directly for the first time since entering the office, "is that everything you taught me about business strategy and market positioning became the foundation for building something you never imagined possible. Your lessons about perception versus reality became my competitive advantage." The statement carried no malice, only the matter-of-fact observation of someone who'd learned to weaponize his father's own wisdom. As Robert Sterling stood surrounded by evidence of his son's secret empire, he finally understood that the young man he'd exiled wasn't just successful. He was operating at a level of business sophistication that made Robert's real estate ventures look like neighborhood lemonade stands. The father who'd spent years teaching lessons about success had become the student discovering how little he actually understood about the person he'd raised. The revelation of Alex's double life unfolded through a series of photographs that Elena had arranged chronologically across the conference table, each image destroying another piece of Robert Sterling's understanding of his son's past 3 years. The first photo showed Alex in a Stanford lecture hall, not struggling with coursework as Robert had believed, but presenting research to a room full of faculty members whose credentials were listed on the back of the image. The date stamp indicated this had occurred during the week Robert remembered Alex calling home to complain about failing grades. "Your son graduated summa cum laude with a dual degree in computer science and business administration," Elena explained, producing the official transcripts that Robert had never seen. "He maintained a 3.97 GPA while simultaneously launching his first startup, which he sold to a Silicon Valley firm for $8 million 6 months before graduation." The transcript showed courses in advanced cryptography, artificial intelligence, and international business law, subjects that required exceptional intelligence and dedication. Robert sank into a leather chair as Elena continued displaying evidence of deception so comprehensive it bordered on performance art. The photographs showed Alex in settings that contradicted everything Robert thought he knew, presenting at technology conferences, meeting with venture capitalists in San Francisco boardrooms, and receiving recognition at industry awards ceremonies. In one image, Alex wore the same disheveled clothes Robert remembered from a particularly heated argument about responsibility, but the timestamp showed it was taken at a MIT symposium where Alex had been a keynote speaker. The electronics store job was actually a cover for his consulting practice, Elena revealed, producing payroll records that showed Alex earning minimum wage for 20 hours per week while simultaneously billing Fortune 500 companies for cybersecurity consultations at rates exceeding $500 per hour. He needed a visible employment record that would satisfy parental expectations while protecting the confidentiality of his real clients. The psychological warfare implicit in Alex's strategy was becoming apparent. He'd constructed a false narrative so convincing that his own father had become its most vocal promoter, criticizing Alex's supposed failures at family gatherings and business events where Robert's disappointment in his son had become a recurring theme. Every public expression of paternal frustration had actually been advertising Alex's cover story to exactly the audiences that needed to believe it. Alex finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years spent maintaining an elaborate fiction. "Do you remember the night you found me passed out on the couch, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and what you assumed was gaming equipment?" Robert nodded, recalling his disgust at what seemed like another example of his son's lack of discipline. "I'd been awake for 36 hours debugging security protocols for a major airline's reservation system. The gaming equipment was actually servers running penetration tests that prevented a cyber attack that could have grounded flights across the eastern seaboard." The confession continued with revelations that recontextualized years of misunderstood interactions. The mysterious phone calls Robert had attributed to social plans were actually encrypted communications with international clients. The packages arriving at the house that Alex claimed were online purchases were actually hardware shipments for testing facilities. The friends Robert had never met weren't imaginary. They were business partners, investors, and technical experts whose identities Alex had protected through carefully maintained separation between his public and private personas. The charity gala where you publicly complained about my lack of direction, Alex continued, accessing photos on his phone, occurred the same week I closed a $12 million acquisition deal and was featured on the cover of Cybersecurity Today magazine. He showed the magazine cover to his father, a professional headshot of Alex in a business suit accompanied by an article titled "The 25-Year-Old CEO Revolutionizing Digital Security." Elena produced financial records showing that Alex's charitable contributions exceeded Robert's annual income, with donations to educational programs, cybersecurity research, and scholarships for underprivileged students studying technology. The giving was structured through foundations that obscured Alex's identity while maximizing impact, following the same principle of strategic invisibility that had governed his entire adult life. Every lecture about family legacy and living up to potential, Alex said, his voice steady but tinged with years of suppressed frustration, came during periods when I was building something that would outlast anything Sterling Properties has ever accomplished. While you criticized my lack of ambition, I was creating technology that protects millions of people's financial data every day. The final photograph Elena presented showed Alex at age 23 shaking hands with the Secretary of Homeland Security during a White House ceremony recognizing young entrepreneurs who'd contributed to national cybersecurity. The image had been taken during the month Robert remembered as particularly disappointing, when Alex had seemed especially unmotivated and spent most of his time in his room with his computers. Robert Sterling realized that his son hadn't just lived a double life. He'd created a masterpiece of strategic deception that had fooled everyone who knew him, including the man who'd raised him from birth. The young man he'd dismissed as a failure had not only succeeded beyond Robert's wildest dreams, but had done so while allowing his father to remain completely ignorant of achievements that would define the next generation of American business leadership. The breakdown began subtly, with Robert Sterling's hands developing a tremor that intensified as each revelation shattered another piece of his self-image as a successful father and businessman. He stood on Alex's terrace overlooking Biscayne Bay, staring at a view that his son owned while he processed the magnitude of his own blindness. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent decades teaching Alex about perception versus reality in business, only to become the victim of the most sophisticated deception he'd ever encountered. "I don't understand," Robert's voice cracked as he turned away from the water to face the son who'd systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about their relationship. "Why would you let me believe you were failing? Why endure years of criticism and disappointment when you could have shown me this empire at any time?" The questions tumbled out with the desperation of a man grasping for logic in a situation that defied his understanding of human motivation. Alex's response came with the measured patience of someone who'd anticipated this moment for years. "Because showing you would have changed everything in ways that wouldn't have served either of us. You needed to believe I was your failure so you could maintain your identity as the successful Sterling patriarch. I needed you to believe it so I could build something without the pressure of living up to expectations I'd already exceeded." The psychological sophistication of his strategy was becoming apparent. Alex hadn't just hidden his success, he'd weaponized his father's need to feel superior. The neighbors who'd gathered outside the estate's gates represented more than casual curiosity. They were witnesses to Robert Sterling's public humiliation on a scale that would reshape his social standing in Coral Gables permanently. Sarah Martinez had been joined by the Peterson family, Mrs. Chen, and several other residents whose presence transformed Alex's revelation into a neighborhood spectacle that would fuel gossip for months. Every person who'd pitied the homeless Alex Sterling 2 days earlier was now observing his father's psychological collapse. "Do you realize what this means?" Robert's voice rose with panic as the social implications became clear. "Everyone thinks I threw out my own son for being worthless when he's actually more successful than I am. The business community, our friends, everyone who knows our family, they're all going to learn that I was too blind to recognize my own son's achievements." The damage to his reputation would be irreversible. particularly in Miami's tight-knit community of wealthy families where perception determined social hierarchy. Elena discreetly withdrew to give father and son privacy, but her presence in the background served as a reminder that Alex commanded professional respect from people who moved in circles Robert had never accessed. The staff moving through the mansion treated Alex with the deference reserved for legitimate power, while Robert found himself increasingly relegated to the role of confused visitor in his son's domain. The psychological impact deepened as Robert began recalling specific incidents with new understanding. The night he'd lectured Alex about responsibility while the young man sat quietly at his computer became a memory of interrupting world-class cybersecurity work. The family dinner where he'd complained about Alex's lack of direction had occurred during the week his son was negotiating a contract worth more than Sterling Properties' annual revenue. Every moment of paternal disappointment had been based on ignorance that now seemed willfully blind. "I called you worthless," Robert whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of waves against Alex's private beach. "I told the neighbors, my business partners, anyone who would listen, that my son was a disappointment who would never amount to anything, and all the time you were building this." He gestured helplessly at the mansion that represented wealth exceeding his own net worth. Alex's expression softened slightly, but carried no forgiveness for years of public humiliation disguised as tough love. "You called me worthless because it served your psychological needs, not because you'd made any effort to understand what I was actually accomplishing. The same business instincts that made you successful in real estate should have detected something suspicious about my lifestyle. But you chose to see what confirmed your existing beliefs rather than investigate contradictions." The realization that his business acumen had failed him in the most important relationship of his life sent Robert into deeper despair. He'd spent 30 years building Sterling Properties through careful market analysis and attention to detail, yet he'd completely missed obvious signs that his son was operating at a level of success that dwarfed his own achievements. The failure wasn't just personal, it was professional, calling into question his judgment in every area of his life. As the sun began setting over Biscayne Bay, casting golden light across water that his son owned, Robert Sterling understood that his exile of Alex hadn't been tough love or necessary discipline. It had been the desperate act of a man whose ego couldn't tolerate evidence of his own inadequacy as a father. The young man he'd thrown away had built an empire while the father who'd dismissed him struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his own blindness. The final revelation came not in Alex's office or on the terrace overlooking his empire, but in the mansion's library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves held not just books, but files that would destroy what remained of Robert Sterling's world. Alex moved to a safe hidden behind a first-edition collection, his fingers working the combination with practiced ease as Elena positioned herself near the door, not as security, but as a witness to what was about to unfold. The documents Alex withdrew weren't business contracts or financial statements, but evidence of crimes that had been hidden for over a decade. "The real reason I built this empire," Alex began, his voice carrying a gravity that made the previous revelations seem like warm-up acts, "wasn't to prove you wrong about my potential. It was to protect myself from what I discovered you'd been doing to Sterling Properties for the past 15 years. He spread photographs across the library table, images of falsified inspection reports, forged permits, and construction documents that bore signatures Robert had never authorized, but which perfectly matched his handwriting. Robert's face went pale as he recognized projects from Sterling Properties' portfolio, but with alterations that revealed systematic fraud extending back to Alex's childhood. Building materials listed as premium grade had been substituted with substandard alternatives. Environmental impact studies had been falsified to hide contamination, and safety inspections had been purchased rather than earned. The scope of corruption was breathtaking, involving dozens of properties and millions of dollars in fraudulent savings that had inflated Sterling Properties' profit margins for years. "I found the first evidence when I was 16, Alex continued, producing emails between Robert and construction supervisors discussing payoffs to building inspectors and strategies for concealing code violations. You left your computer unlocked one night, and what I thought would be a casual look at family business became the discovery that my father was running a criminal enterprise disguised as a real estate development company. The betrayal in his voice wasn't about being underestimated. It was about learning that the man who'd raised him was systematically endangering the safety of families who trusted Sterling Properties. Elena stepped forward with additional files that revealed the true scope of Robert's corruption. Environmental reports showed that 3 Sterling Properties developments had been built on contaminated land without proper remediation, exposing hundreds of families to toxic chemicals that would affect their health for decades. Safety violations in a downtown office complex had been covered up through bribes, creating structural weaknesses that could prove catastrophic during Miami's hurricane season. The electronics store job wasn't just cover for my consulting practice, Alex revealed, his strategic deception taking on new meaning. I needed legitimate employment that kept me out of Sterling Properties while I built the resources to eventually expose what you'd been doing. Every night you thought I was gaming or partying, I was actually documenting evidence and building the financial independence I'd need to survive what comes next. The psychological manipulation Alex had employed suddenly became clear. His apparent failures hadn't just protected his business empire. They'd created the perfect cover for an investigation that had taken years to complete. His father's criticism and eventual exile had actually served Alex's purposes, providing moral justification for the destruction of Robert's life while maintaining plausible deniability about his own motivations. Robert's hands shook as he examined construction photographs that showed shoddy workmanship hidden behind facades designed to impress buyers. Families had moved into homes with foundational cracks concealed by cosmetic repairs, electrical systems that violated basic safety codes, and plumbing that would fail within years of installation. The human cost of his cost-cutting measures was documented in detail, with follow-up reports showing health problems and property damage that could be traced directly to Sterling Properties' construction practices. You taught me that perception matters more than reality in business, Alex said, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone delivering a death sentence. But you forgot that reality eventually reveals itself. And when it does, perception becomes irrelevant. Everything you built, every relationship you cultivated, every reputation you established, it's all based on fraud that's about to become public knowledge. The final document Alex produced was a letter addressed to the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, detailing Robert's crimes with evidence that would guarantee criminal prosecution and civil liability exceeding Sterling Properties' total assets. The letter was dated 3 months earlier but had never been sent, representing Alex's insurance policy against the father who'd raised him to believe that success justified any means necessary to achieve it. This was never about revenge for being underestimated, Alex concluded, meeting his father's horrified gaze directly. This was about justice for the families you've poisoned, the buyers you've defrauded, and the community you've endangered through 15 years of systematic corruption. You didn't just fail to recognize my success. You failed to understand that I'd discovered yours was built on crimes that make your treatment of me look insignificant by comparison. The silence that followed Alex's revelation stretched across the library like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the private beach that now seemed more like a fortress than a luxury amenity. Robert Sterling sat motionless in a leather chair that had probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, staring at evidence of his own corruption while his son watched with the patience of someone who'd spent years planning this exact moment. The golden light filtering through the library's windows cast shadows that seemed to divide the room into territories, Alex's domain of moral authority versus Robert's shrinking space of desperate calculation. You have a choice, Alex finally said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering a business ultimatum rather than destroying his own father. I can submit this evidence to the state attorney's office tomorrow morning, which will result in criminal charges, federal investigation, and civil lawsuits that will destroy not just you, but every family who trusted Sterling Properties with their life savings. He gestured toward the documents spread across the table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Or you can choose a different path that minimizes the damage to innocent people while ensuring justice is served. Elena stepped forward with a folder containing legal documents that had clearly been prepared in advance, their existence proving that Alex had anticipated this confrontation down to the smallest detail. Option 1 involves your immediate resignation from Sterling Properties, transfer of all assets to a remediation fund for affected families, and your voluntary cooperation with authorities in exchange for reduced criminal exposure. Her professional demeanor couldn't disguise the fact that she was delivering terms that would strip Robert of everything he'd spent 30 years building. Robert's mind raced through the implications of public exposure, criminal prosecution that would result in federal prison time, civil lawsuits that would exceed his ability to pay, and social destruction that would make his current humiliation seem trivial by comparison. The business community that had respected him for decades would learn that his success had been built on fraud that endangered the safety of Miami families. His name would become synonymous with corruption in a city where reputation determined access to everything from country clubs to charitable boards. Option 2, Alex continued, producing additional documents that outlined an alternative that was barely less devastating, involves Sterling Properties being transferred to new management that will implement proper construction standards and compensate affected families through increased company resources rather than external litigation. The proposal would allow Robert to maintain the fiction that he was stepping down for health reasons rather than fleeing criminal prosecution, but would still result in the loss of everything he'd built. The psychological sophistication of Alex's strategy was becoming apparent. He'd constructed a scenario where Robert's only choices involved different degrees of destruction, with the illusion of control masking the fact that his son held complete power over the outcome. Every option led to Robert's downfall, but the path of least resistance required his voluntary cooperation in dismantling his own empire. The families living in contaminated developments, Elena added, producing medical reports and property damage assessments, deserve compensation that reflects the long-term health impacts and financial losses they'll experience due to Sterling Properties' construction practices. The human cost data was devastating. Children with respiratory problems, elderly residents with compromised immune systems, and young families facing decades of medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. Robert found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. If I agree to option 2, what guarantee do I have that this evidence won't surface later? What's to stop you from destroying me anyway once you have control of the company? The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of his son's motivations. Alex wasn't interested in prolonged revenge, but in swift justice that served the greater good. Because destroying you serves no purpose once the real problem is solved, Alex replied, his tone carrying the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who'd thought through every angle. My goal isn't your punishment. It's preventing future victims and compensating past ones. If you choose cooperation over defiance, the evidence remains sealed as long as you honor the agreement and never return to construction or real estate development. The terms were harsh but survivable. Robert would lose his business empire but avoid criminal prosecution, maintain enough assets to live comfortably while accepting permanent exile from the industry that had defined his identity. The alternative was complete destruction that would leave him bankrupt, imprisoned, and socially ostracized in ways that would affect not just him, but potentially other family members who'd been unaware of his crimes. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, Alex concluded, standing and moving toward the library door with Elena following close behind. The state attorney's office opens at 8 a.m., and I have an appointment scheduled that can either involve delivering evidence of ongoing crimes or confirmation that Sterling Properties has been transferred to ethical management that will address past violations voluntarily. As father and son faced each other across the library that had become a courtroom, Robert Sterling realized that the young man he'd raised and ultimately exiled had not only built an empire that dwarfed his own achievements, but had done so while constructing the perfect trap for a father whose success had been built on the very corruption that Alex's technology was designed to prevent. 6 months after the confrontation in Alex's library, the transformation of both Sterling empires was complete. though the changes had unfolded so carefully that Miami's business community attributed them to natural evolution rather than the systematic destruction and reconstruction that had actually occurred. Robert Sterling lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Aventura, his morning routine now consisting of coffee on a small balcony that overlooked a parking lot instead of Biscayne Bay, while his son occupied the executive suite of the Sterling Properties building that had once represented Robert's greatest achievement. The transfer had been executed with surgical precision, with Alex assuming control of Sterling Properties while simultaneously implementing remediation programs that addressed 15 years of systematic fraud without triggering the criminal investigation that would have destroyed innocent employees and subcontractors. The families affected by contaminated developments received compensation packages that exceeded their original property values, while new construction standards elevated Sterling Properties from a corrupt enterprise to an industry leader in sustainable building practices. Elena Vasquez had transitioned from Alex's personal assistant to chief operating officer of the combined Sterling empire, overseeing the integration of Sterling Tech Solutions' cybersecurity expertise with Sterling Properties construction projects to create smart buildings that prioritized both environmental sustainability and digital security. The synergy between Alex's two enterprises created a competitive advantage that attracted clients seeking development partners who understood 21st century challenges. The neighborhood that had witnessed Robert's humiliation now observed his son's rise with the mixture of awe and envy that Miami's wealthy communities reserved for generational wealth transfers that exceeded normal expectations. Sarah Martinez no longer needed to walk her dog past the Sterling mansion to satisfy her curiosity. The property had been donated to a technology education foundation that Alex had established to provide scholarships for underprivileged students studying cybersecurity and sustainable engineering. Robert's daily routine now included reading business publications that featured his son's achievements with the same fascination that accident victims might study their own medical records, searching for clues about how their world had changed so completely. Articles about Sterling Properties' transformation from traditional developer to innovative technology integrator praised Alex's vision while carefully avoiding any mention of the corruption that had necessitated the company's rebirth under new leadership. The former Sterling patriarch's social circle had contracted to other retirees who spent their mornings at coffee shops discussing grandchildren and medical appointments rather than multi-million-dollar business deals. His Coral Gables Country Club membership had been quietly terminated due to restructured financial circumstances, though Alex had ensured his father maintained sufficient resources to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. The psychological impact of watching his son succeed where he had failed extended beyond financial loss to a fundamental questioning of every assumption Robert had made about talent, character, and the relationship between perception and reality. The young man he'd dismissed as worthless had not only built something greater than Sterling Properties, but had done so while maintaining moral standards that Robert had abandoned in pursuit of profit margins. Alex's office now occupied the top floor of the Sterling Properties building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided views of construction sites where his new standards were being implemented, and luxury developments that prioritized environmental responsibility over maximum profit extraction. The walls displayed awards recognizing both his cybersecurity innovations and his commitment to sustainable construction practices, creating a legacy that would outlast anything his father had accomplished. The irony wasn't lost on Miami's business community that the Sterling name had been elevated to new heights by the son who'd been publicly dismissed as a failure, while the father who'd built the original empire had faded into the kind of obscurity usually reserved for executives who'd been caught embezzling from pension funds. Success, it seemed, wasn't always visible to those who refused to look beyond their own expectations and assumptions. In the evenings, when Alex stood on his Biscayne Bay terrace watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, he sometimes thought about the father who'd raised him to understand that perception could be more powerful than reality, never imagining that his son would use that lesson to construct a deception so complete it would ultimately reveal the truth about both of them. The empire he'd built wasn't just about technology or real estate. It was about proving that success without integrity was merely an elaborate form of failure that eventually consumed everything it touched. The final power reversal came on a rainy Thursday evening when Robert Sterling stood outside the gates of his former mansion, now transformed into a scholarship foundation bearing his son's name. Through the windows, he could see young students from underprivileged backgrounds learning the cybersecurity skills that Alex had mastered in secret, their faces bright with the same determination Robert had once dismissed in his own son. Alex found his father there, shoulders hunched against the Miami rain, and for the first time in months, approached him without Elena or security. "Dad," he said quietly, offering an umbrella that cost more than Robert's monthly rent. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had changed between them. "I was wrong about you," Robert whispered, his voice breaking with the admission he'd been rehearsing for months. "Not just about your success, but about who you are as a person. You could have destroyed me completely, but instead you chose justice. You became the man I should have been." In that moment, the roles were finally clear. The father who had lost everything stood humbled before the son who had gained it all through integrity rather than corruption. Alex's empire wasn't built on the foundations Robert had laid, but on the moral principles Robert had failed to teach. "Sometimes," Alex replied, his hand briefly touching his father's shoulder, "losing everything is the only way to find out who you really are." The rain continued to fall on both Sterling men, one who had built his legacy on lies and one who had built his future on truth. In the end, the son had become the father he'd always needed, while the father had learned that true success couldn't be measured in dollars, but in the lives you choose to protect rather than exploit. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with redemption, not for the father who had fallen, but for the son who had risen high enough to offer forgiveness from a place of unshakable strength. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.